Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to another in the Seedman series on societal impact webinars. My name is Michael DeWilde. I'm the director of the Koeze Business Ethics Initiative. It's my pleasure today to be here with Mika from Steelcase, Director of Sustainability there, and Alison Sutter from the City of Grand Rapids, Director of Sustainability and Performance Office Manager there as well. Apologize for the short delay. I think we're all used to coming out of the pandemic, the occasional technical glitch. So hopefully you're all with us and ready to go. Changing our lives, perspectives from Steelcase and the City of Grand Rapids on facing climate change challenges. We'll start big picture and then maybe drill down to some more specifics. Marilyn and Alison, thank you to both of you for being here. Appreciate you taking the time. Marilyn, if you don't mind, I'll start with you. It wasn't too long ago, only a few years ago, where Steelcase was perhaps understandably a little shy about using the phrase climate change, afraid of that. Of course, it's a politically fraught term, or at least it was, and maybe scaring off investors, et cetera. Could you take us through a little bit how we've moved from being nervous about that term to now Steelcase embracing it? It's on your website. People talk about it on a regular basis.
Yeah, sure. So I would say back in 2013 is when we first started talking about climate change internally on our intranet site. And even then, I thought it was interesting. I looked back at some old records. The comment that was made on our, we call it our Spark site. So it's like any sort of social media type thing. There were absolutely no comments from other employees to the post that was set out there by a sustainability person. So I thought that was pretty interesting. But otherwise, our first internal climate change strategy was developed in 2015. And that was actually associated much more with our commitment to 100% renewable energy purchasing. And that's equivalent to our global electricity usage, I should say. So basically, it's been since about end of 2017 that we've felt really comfortable talking about climate change, global warming, all of the potential, impacts here at Steelcase. And I do think it is a vocabulary issue. I think for years, it's almost as though we couldn't say it, to friends as much too. So I don't know why, it was necessarily that way, but I think now it's the norm. So that's a good thing. And
it's the norm because that's driven largely by what science is telling us, because your competitors are on board in the same way, because what do you think is driving that or motivating?
I think definitely because of the science. So, and we've known about the science for a long time. I think it was that almost helpless feeling of what are we going to do as, one company? What is it to, combat climate change? And I think once there were these science-based targets designed that companies could go after, that kind of opened up some possibility to us to just being much more proactive about addressing climate change.
And one more question for you, if you don't mind, before I turn my attention to Alison. Since you were the most scientific amongst the three of us here, for listeners who may or may not be familiar with the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the scientists sponsored by the UN, can you give us just a brief kind of state of the art, where we are in terms of what the science is telling us?
Sure. So I think probably the most critical thing is that the recent IPCC report talked about the importance of trying to limit global warming to just 1.5 degrees Celsius. And so when we talk about limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees, that's with the knowledge that we've already had global temperatures rise just over 1 degree Celsius. So we really have less than half a degree Celsius to play with before the IPCC and other scientists are saying we will really see much more dramatic effects from climate change. I know there are projections that it may be more than 3 degrees Celsius warming that we would see in the coming decades, and that's when we would definitely be afraid to see much more flooding, much more just general crazy weather impacts. But I know even from just interesting scientific facts about the difference between like 1.5 degrees of global warming versus 2 degrees. And 2 degrees used to be the mark that everyone was trying to stay below. But there's a huge difference just between 1.5 and 2 degrees. And some of the facts indicate that at 2 degrees Celsius warming, we could expect to see the Arctic sea ice, expect to see a lack of it 3 times as much, or 10 times as much, as at 1.5 degrees. And it's pretty scary to think of the difference because it just seems like such a small temperature amount, but makes a huge difference. And yes, I see a comment about the effects on biodiversity as well. So huge impacts all the way around from what seems like a very small increase in temperature.
Great, thanks.
Yeah.
Alison, it's climate change. Do you think, in your position, climate change is becoming a little bit like how people used to talk about the weather, and that is everybody talks about it, nobody does anything about it? From where I sit in the business ethics seat, there's an ongoing debate about, okay, who's got the most responsibility here? Individuals, businesses like Steelcase, or government? The preponderance of the argument comes down on the side of government because it has the tools. It's the institution that's most powerfully implicated in helping steer the course of our lives. As you sit where you do, what you're responsible for the city of Grand Rapids, can you tell us a little bit about, high level first, the efforts on the part of the city, and then how you respond to that question of responsibility?
Yeah, well, thanks. I appreciate being here today. And I think that, just kind of very high level, a few things that the city's working on right now. Just a lot of credit to my predecessors who were here at the city and in the community that really started the sustainability or environmental conservation movement well back into 2005. From the city's perspective, that was when Mayor George Hartwell was elected and really had a passion. But Steelcase, and other businesses and academic institutions were similarly starting their journeys around sustainability as well. And so it really was a fantastic time for our community in terms of the business community, academia, and city government all having an aligned interest to pursue sustainability. So we've done a lot over the time. I won't go into all of it now, but right now, we're really focused, I would say, when we think about greenhouse gas emissions in an urban area, the predominantly is created from 2 areas: buildings, and also from our transportation sector. And so in my time with the city, which has been about 4.5 years, I've been predominantly focused on the building side, both our own municipal facilities, where we've been working to implement energy efficiency, of course, but pretty excited here in a couple of weeks. We're actually going to flip the switch on for a 1 megawatt ground-mounted solar array that we just installed at our Lake Michigan filtration plant, which is out in Grand Haven Township. Mary Ellen was on our Energy Advisory Committee, who was a great partner in helping us work through strategies to determine where and when we should implement solar. And so that's a really exciting project for us. We've had a long-standing 100% renewable energy goal for our municipal operations since about 2008. We're at 37.5%. And after this solar array goes live, we'll be at about 41%. But now in the realm of renewable energy, really spending a lot of time trying to find some solutions to installing solar on our closed Superfund site, the Butterworth landfill, which is something that's been important to the city. And doing that in partnership with community to allow those renewable energy sources to benefit residents, businesses, and municipal operations. But one other thing I'll just mention briefly before turning to your question about, whose responsibility is it? So we also just this past September passed another municipal goal. City Manager Mark Washington adopted a goal for an 85% carbon reduction by 2030, which I believe is probably one of the most progressive goals that I have seen. It definitely surpasses the state of Michigan and the United States established goals from a governmental perspective. And we believe that if we achieve our 100% renewable energy goal, that'll put us on the path to achieving that 85% reduction. And then we are looking to try to accomplish net zero carbon by 2040. But it's been interesting when you ask about, our role, because we have had calls from the community to consider a community-wide carbon reduction goal. And one of the things that I have been learning and trying to understand is when you establish those types of goals, who is responsible for achieving those goals? How much do those goals cost to implement and to actually achieve? So how do we know who to hold accountable for the measurements that we have? And oftentimes, city government does not have the authority to force businesses or residents to change behavior to such a degree that it would actually accomplish the really large scale significant reductions. Now, of course, we do have some tools that we can use, but I think that that's what's interesting when you ask about, responsibility and who can do what and who should be doing what. Very grateful that we have businesses in our community like Steelcase and others that are voluntarily taking actions on their own. But that won't be enough based on the science that Mary Ellen already touched on. And even though maybe the local government or state government might have the ability to impact things more broadly, most businesses and individuals are not interested in having the government regulate them. And so there's a kind of a tension there in terms of trying to determine, the effective tools that we have to actually bring down the emissions and who has those tools. And then I think I would just close with, going back to kind of, I think a couple of points you made. There's a lot of disconnect around what does climate change, what does it mean? I think that there is a small percentage of our community and society that really understands the science and the mechanics of global warming and climate change and what is needed. By and large, I think most people don't. And I think that people, particularly in Grand Rapids, don't necessarily think that it is impacting us as much in our community as it could be perhaps those that have, extreme floods and fires and hurricanes, et cetera. But it is really impacting us here in our community to some significant degree and predominantly for our vulnerable communities. And so I think it's really trying to help people understand, what is happening in our community and how is it tied to climate change so that people start to better understand why it's so important for us to be working on this now.
Marilyn, if you don't mind, I'd like to pick up on one thing Alison said before I come back to you. So the point you just made, many people, especially in our community, don't really understand, don't see the effects. So can you give us an example or two? Because as you both know, Michigan is oftentimes held up as, well, if it's going to happen, Michigan's the place to be. That's where you want to be when it goes south every place else. So, and it will be inequitably distributed, the effects as you implied. So what's happening in Michigan that we should keep an eye out for and that maybe should motivate us more than it has?
And Michael, were you asking me to start on that one?
If you will.
Yes. So a couple things that I like to provide as examples, right, for climate change here in the community. We, of course, had our polar vortex, I think was early 2019, that we experienced with just significant extreme colds over 2 weeks. And really one of the biggest issues was schools were closed. And therefore, that meant that children who rely on free and reduced breakfast and lunch, all of a sudden, those children and those families were in a place where they were not prepared to be able to provide food and meals to children. And I think a lot of our phenomenal community-based organizations and service providers step up in those times and really help to provide services. But I don't think they've been thinking about it as a climate change issue. And that's why I often provide this example, because to me, when we have children in our community that are not able to access the breakfast and the lunch that they are planning on, all of a sudden, due to this polar vortex and this climate emergency that is happening, that to me is a very prominent example of climate change that has a significant impact on people in our community. We also, of course, had floods in 2013. It's one of the highest floods we'd ever had. And for those that have been around Grand Rapids for some time, probably saw those, infamous pictures of the fish floating by the windows due to the floods coming up over the Grand River. And that, I should have checked my numbers since that time, but I'm pretty sure that in terms of like the city's request for damage to public infrastructure was well above $1 million. I think perhaps even pushing $2 million in terms of bridges and facilities and roads that were destroyed in that flood. We did ultimately invest $15 million after that to improve our flood walls downtown. And when the flood of 2018, which was pretty much the exact same level, we had less than $100,000 in damage to our public infrastructure. So significant improvement there, but it's not enough. We're going to have more weather events. You mentioned that, and I have some information I can share about what has been identified as the changes that are going to happen in Michigan. And I typically boil it down to, on average, it's going to get warmer, but mostly it's going to get warmer in the winter. And on average, we're going to have a lot more precipitation, but that is going to come in the springtime, which is when we suffer the most floods, going back and forth between kind of the winter temperatures and rolling into the spring and having these really large storms. And then also when we have these storms of precipitation, whether it be snow or rain, they're going to come, the intense storms will come more often and are actually will kind of have a deluge of where all of it is dropped onto our community at one time, which has significant impacts for businesses, right? Relying on people getting to work, relying on transportation of goods and services, as well as, just our communities and trying to get to school, et cetera. And so that's, more quote unquote, lake effect snow is going to be coming and those big snowstorms, but then with kind of a period almost of drought in between, which we did see last summer where we got these huge rainfalls, and then we seemed to go for a really long time without any rain. And then we would have another huge rainfall, and that has a lot of implications for it as well. And I think the last one I would say, particularly from a public health perspective, our average temperatures are going to increase, and we're going to have more extreme heat days in the summer. And for those that are, I'm privileged and I live in a home where I have air conditioning and I can pay for my air conditioning. And so to what extent is that going to affect me? Probably not a lot. But we have persons that are suffering from homelessness in our community. Most of our housing in Grand Rapids was built well before air conditioning was ever installed. We have a lot of facilities that support elderly in our community or those with medical needs that were actually built at a time where a large amount of air conditioning wasn't needed. And if we don't start working on improving and thinking about the fact that we're going to have more extreme heat and how will that impact our residents in our community, that's very concerning to me.
So a lot to unpack there. Thanks. I'll go back to Mary Ellen for a second. So Marilyn, I'm sure Steelcase is making all kinds of plans for disruptions in supply chain and that sort of thing as weather impacts your global operations. But picking up on what Alison just said, are you making plans to address the kinds of local weather events that she referenced as well?
Yes, we are. And we've had a lot of experiences over the years with these different weather impacts. And I think, kind of back to the vocabulary issue of what do we call something that's climate change induced versus something that's just, crazy weather that hits a certain location. But it's obviously becoming more obvious that all of these extreme weather events around the world are related to, climate change issues. So at Steelcase, we've been fortunate to have our facilities themselves be very well protected. But what we've seen are employees at different locations throughout the world definitely be affected by different weather events. We had major tornadoes in Alabama back in 2014 or 2015. And I think 40 employees' homes were affected and really some were devastated too by those tornadoes. We were lucky that our facility there was not affected directly, but as a result of it, what we chose to do was to build these very large tornado shelters that can withstand, extreme wind conditions, 250 miles per hour, so that we can make sure that employees, at least when they're at our facilities, are very well protected. And then we've had all kinds of flooding in recent years at our facility. We have a couple of facilities. One is a manufacturing facility in Malaysia, and another is a business center there. And again, we had no damage, no direct impacts or anything to our facilities, but employees, almost 30 employees, were impacted by the flooding that was occurring there. And I know we've had hurricane issues with our facility in Reynosa, and again, that's in Mexico. Again, our facility was not hurt, but employees were affected. And so when we have these kinds of situations, fortunately, we're a pretty tight community within Steelcase, even though we're also spread out globally. And so we'll have a lot of volunteering and donations that are meant to help people get through those times. But it's not a coincidence. I mean, these are happening much more frequently than ever before. And I know you mentioned supply chain issues too. Certainly we're experiencing a lot of supply chain challenges right now due to effects of the pandemic. But we've also had in the past suppliers who have been directly affected by floods and or fires. I remember there was one that affected a supplier in Thailand that was really critical for us. And that's a huge issue, for a company that has a global supply chain. You become very dependent on suppliers. It's all part of our value chain. It's essential to getting our products out there. So we realize how vulnerable, we are with all of these kind of unpredictable weather events. So it really highlights the importance of everyone around the world trying to do something to mitigate the effects of climate change.
Well, let me pick up on that last. Mitigation or adaptation? We talked about tornado shelters and that sort of thing, and I'll ask this to both of you. And perhaps I'm unfairly pessimistic about us staying under that 1.5 degrees Celsius ceiling. But, pretend we weren't on a webinar, we were just talking amongst the three of us here. Would you advise me to pursue the path of mitigation? Of course, you want to lower the emissions in terms of methane, carbon, et cetera. But to what degree, or maybe what's the balance between that and adaptation? Alison, let me come back to you to start.
Sure.
Is the city looking maybe more at adaptation and mitigation at this point?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I appreciate it. Really, historically, our efforts have been predominantly around climate mitigation within our own respective facilities, right? How are we achieving 100% renewable energy and energy efficiency within our own operations? And probably about almost 3 years ago is when I started to transition and say, we really need to be focused more on adaptation, and we need to be focused more on community-wide programs, services, interventions. What can we be doing to look holistically at the community? And I think that, I'm still on a learning path there, because we were I would say almost 100% mitigation for a while. And then based on some of the weather patterns that I shared with you, and I think, the city, one of our top values, one of our 6 values is equity, and sustainability is a top value as well, which I'm very grateful for. But in terms of, the way that I'm doing work and really trying to authentically lead with equity, I feel that it's a much harder case to make that you're addressing equity through greenhouse gas mitigation. I think that the majority of greenhouse gas emissions are created from those that are privileged or affluent, or corporations or businesses that have the ability to manufacture and provide the goods and services that we need in our community. But when communities experience these severe weather events, and some that Mary Ellen was speaking to, our vulnerable communities, and in Grand Rapids, we're predominantly talking about our Black and Brown community, are hit first and hit worst. And when I think about, what is the greatest good and benefit that we should be trying to provide to our community, I have really switched my mentality from that mitigation perspective to more of the adaptation perspective. So just as one example, we're working really hard, particularly on low-income housing, where when the time the house was built, insulation wasn't even required. And so people are living in a home that they're paying astronomical amounts of natural gas bills in the wintertime because there's no insulation. And so that's very hard financially, particularly when we're in an affordable housing crisis. But then even in the summertime, as we get these extreme weather events, it also makes it difficult for people with health conditions to live in those homes. And so I believe that we can be thinking about adaptation and how are we better protecting our communities and thinking about those things. And does that mean installing more air conditioning? Yeah, I think it'll probably mean that. And does that mean more electricity consumption? Of course. But I think that that's more important holistically, particularly when leading with equity, to think about, what is best for our residents and for our communities. And you mentioned it, if we were just in safe spaces and circles, I really have concerns about our ability globally to meet the 1.5 degrees Celsius target that Mary Ellen spoke to that's been established, because I have seen a lot of people come out, organizations, government organizations, even businesses or others, with these very audacious carbon reduction goals, which I am glad that we have the goals, but what I have not seen is an actual plan to implement to achieve those goals and the funding to back what is needed to actually achieve those goals. I mean, when we went through the pandemic and, global systems shut down for at least a period of 2 to 3 months, that barely scratched the surface in terms of what we need to actually meet those greenhouse gas reduction goals. And so I think that's very concerning. And in light of that, and taking that information into consideration, I think it's important we still work on mitigation, but these events are happening now. They've already been happening. I know they're going to continue to happen at a more rapid pace. And I am working to focus the city's efforts more around adaptation at this point in time, knowing that those efforts, are really, they're here, they're now, they're in our community right now. And I think it's important. And I'd like to see other governmental agencies stepping up more and talking more about adaptation.
And maybe Mary Ellen can speak to this. Alison, is there even more you'd like to see from private businesses? Do you point to Steelcase as a model, or it's like, well, Steelcase, they're getting there, but.
Well, and when I think from an adaptation perspective, I do think it's easier for corporations, right? I come from private corporations before I came to the city government. And I think it's easier for businesses to focus on and invest in strategies that can reduce your greenhouse gas emissions, right? When you look at a business and you ask Steelcase, what can you do to address adaptation? That's a much harder question in terms of, what can have a positive impact on your business as well, right? I mean, I think it's phenomenal that they built tornado shelters, right? Looking out for their employees. And that's huge, because if you don't have employees to come to any of your businesses to work because of what they've suffered in the community, well, it doesn't matter at that point in time, your business is going to suffer. So, but when we think a lot about adaptation, it's things like green infrastructure or stormwater management. Also thinking a lot, like I mentioned, I think about, thinking about our buildings and are we prepared for the climate changes that we know are coming. So I think hopefully businesses are thinking about that, particularly if you're in a flood area, right? Don't have your generator in the basement if you're a business, because that's not going to help when, and that was something that the hospitals in Boston learned after Hurricane, I think it was Sandy. And so I do think there are things from an adaptation perspective. Planting a lot more trees has a multitude of benefits from a health perspective, reducing urban heat island effect, producing clean air, et cetera. And it helps a lot from an adaptation perspective as well. But I do think in the adaptation world, at least at this time, most of the things that I'm thinking about probably are better suited for governmental agencies, right? Thinking about your flood systems, how you're planning your city, where you're allowing buildings to be built based on flood zones and flood mapping, and things of that nature. But I'd love to hear what Mary Ellen thinks and what are some of the other adaptation things maybe that Steelcase is doing that I'm not aware of.
Yeah, so I would say in the answer to Michael's question, it's kind of like we need all of the above. So we definitely need to reduce the amount of greenhouse gas emissions, we're releasing. And that goes for everyone around the world. Ideally, we'd stop somehow, but that's not possible to completely stop. So reduce as much as possible. But we also have to remove carbon dioxide from the air. And at the same time, I think we have to prepare for the consequences of too much warming. And I share your concerns that we won't be able to stay at just a 1.5 degree level of warming. I don't see how we could possibly keep it to that level. I think that's just what is recommended by the science. But for instance, even when corporations like Steelcase set science-based targets to achieve, and these are extremely challenging emission reduction targets that we're going after, even then, the most ambitious target that we can pursue officially through this third party, the Science-Based Targets Initiative, is a 1.5 degree warming target. So it's not like very many people are undershooting, for 1.5 degrees. It's going to be extremely challenging to try to shoot not to go over 1.5 degrees. But that's only for, the companies, the cities, the states, et cetera, that are fortunate enough to be able to set strategies like that. I mean, there are plenty out there who don't have a reduction strategy in mind at all. And same goes for many of us on the residential side. I think as much as we may see these large companies, stepping forward, doing, really great things about trying to reduce emissions, it's not like everyone, every person individually in their homes is doing the same thing. And we have to adapt. We have to prepare to deal with the consequences of, crazy warming patterns. Crazy, I shouldn't say warming because it's not necessarily warming. It could be colder for many regions of the world, but just very different, very unpredictable, extreme weather events.
There are two questions I want to pick up on there, but Alison, I want to come back to you. And you mentioned in your opening remarks that there was maybe a certain amount of frustration because the city government can only do so much. Perhaps there are unrealistic expectations about how much you can help inspire or even coerce businesses and citizens to do perhaps what is in finally our own best interest. So what are some of those obstacles, whether you're working with the state or utilities, maybe something the rest of us should be aware of as we're thinking about what the city can do and can't do?
Yeah, thanks. And this was something that before I ever came to work for a local government organization, I didn't have an awareness or an understanding of. And we've even identified just as a broader goal at the city of Grand Rapids that we need to do more to help the civic government understanding within our community. So people do have a better understanding of, we have a charter that requires us to do certain things by law, and address climate change is not one of them. Provide public safety services and provide a water utility and host elections are those services that are required by our charter. Of course, we have some other legal requirements or contractual requirements as well that we offer. But, when I think about really kind of the top three areas, when I think about addressing emissions, as I mentioned, really buildings, how clean is the energy that we're getting, and also transportation, right? And so buildings, it took me a long time to and to understand, and I even have a background as an attorney, but the state of Michigan regulates legally and regulatory building and energy codes. And the city of Grand Rapids, or any city in Michigan, is prohibited from doing anything above and beyond what that state code requires. And unfortunately, the last time the state elected to update the code was 2015. Thankfully, we're working through a process right now to update it to the 2001 international code that has been adopted, which would come with significant improvements for any newly constructed building or significantly remodeled building. But again, that is something that is managed at the state level and that they have the authority to do. So I don't have the ability to force buildings in Grand Rapids to achieve a certain Energy Star score or to reduce the amount of energy they're using by X amount. The second one, talking about the grid, of course, cleaning your grid. And if all of the electricity and if we still have natural gas that we're receiving can come from renewables when natural gas can't, and that's another part is electrification. Again, something outside of the city's ability to require, because that is directly under the authority of the energy code. But even cleaning the grid, we have investor-owned utilities. Some places have municipal utilities and they have the ability to move more quickly and perhaps more progressively. Holland Board of Public Works is a great example. They're doing some phenomenal work there because they have a municipal utility there and are able to implement things like on-bill financing and some other things to help incentivize reductions. But we're really at a place where either the state legislature would have to pass new laws requiring our utilities to meet certain, renewable standards. And I don't think that will happen just based on the understanding and awareness of the dynamics of our legislature. And so I'm also grateful that both DTE and consumers and even Vicinity in the city of Grand Rapids that provides steam have come and made voluntary commitments, but they are voluntary and there's nothing that's holding those utilities to that. And I don't have the authority or the power to make them do anything. As a large customer and as I think they're one of our strategic partners, as are we for them. I think we can have conversations and I explain the urgency around wanting to achieve more renewables well before 2040 or 2050. But again, that is something really outside of the control of the city. And then lastly, when it comes to transportation, right, we have very little authority at the city level to direct, what a fleet has to be made of or what type of vehicles are allowed to be in a fleet or how many emissions they can give off. By and large, vehicle regulations are passed at the US level with the EPA and the CAFE standards and requirements. And so, could we take away all of our parking structures? Yes. I think that the private market would fill in those parking structures, right? So there would still be parking, but I think that the transportation one is really tricky because the city of Grand Rapids also does not own or operate the Rapid, which is our public transit system. So we don't have the authority to force them to have electric buses or anything of that, or even the Grand Rapids public school system, which I would love to see more investment to help support school bus systems convert from dirty diesel fuels that are churning up bad air pollution surrounding our youngest residents in our community to really help support the transition to electric vehicles. But again, those are some of the big things and they're really outside of the control of the city. But I guess to wrap up, I would say the things that are within our control, right? We are in the middle of our master planning process and climate change and environmental justice have been identified as key themes. So people can engage in that process and help determine, zoning ordinances and how our land can be used. We also have economic development incentives. So I'm working collaboratively with that department and creatively to try to figure out ways, how could we incentivize businesses coming and receiving tax benefits from us to see if we could incentivize them to go above and beyond what's required by law. There are voluntary programs. How successful are those? And are they going to move us fast enough to get to where we need to be? That's questionable. And then we do have the ability to pass some policies at the local government level. And I've been spending a lot of time through our EH0 program thinking about that from a buildings perspective. But again, it's quite limited in terms of the opportunities that we have for that.
Thank you. That's actually really helpful. So this is for both of you. And it's going to sound a bit accusatory. I don't mean it to be. I mean it to be an opportunity to actually address what I think is a legitimate concern. So I'd say most of my certainly undergraduate students are in their early 20s. And when I use the word sustainability or ask them what their response is to the word sustainability, at this point, a lot of them roll their eyes, right? I don't know if it's because it's just simply overused. Nobody's ever defined it especially well. It seems to cover a multitude of sins, or they think that maybe less so government, but businesses use it as a kind of greenwashing term. Anyway, they've got their suspicions about it. So A, is it still a useful term? And B, what can you tell me that would help me go back to them and say, no, wait, there's good, sustainable work being done. Don't give up. It's our last and maybe only best hope. Maybe Mary Ellen, I don't know if you want to.
Yeah, so yeah, that's an interesting question. Again, terminology matters, and it is a challenge too for us. So before I even answer your question directly, the thought struck me that we had a student group that recently helped us from the U of M Sustainability Master's Program work on a climate risk assessment for Steelcase. And it was interesting because they said they surveyed more than 50 of our suppliers around the world and tried getting, all kinds of information about their preparation from a physical and kind of transition risk standpoint. And the supplier's perspective was that they were not doing things to necessarily adapt or necessarily prepare for climate change, but the types of answers they were giving were showing that they were in fact doing things. And it was really more of the vocabulary, it was more of what are you attributing these challenging, weather patterns and other occurrences to. And maybe you're not yet recognizing that it's a specific climate change related event, but good to hear that you are starting to really address those risks and make sure you're adapting to them. But I would say, yeah, for us, it's been interesting. I almost need more, maybe give me your question again one more time.
Well, there's a prevailing sense that sustainability is
the word itself.
Maybe overstated its welcome.
Yeah.
People have only a vague sense of what it means, or more cynically, that it's being used by companies to cover what continue to be a multitude of sins around, extractive capitalism.
Yeah.
Which, you're doing some things on the margins, but at the end of the day, you're still leveraging or mortgaging our future against short-term profit. You know what I mean?
Yeah. No. The term is so general that it's not that helpful of a term, I think, and it is overused. It's certainly overused in a marketing sense, and it's used to an extreme, like you said, sometimes in a greenwashing perspective. And some of the claims that are made are so technical anyway that it's difficult for people to, first of all, trust them, but secondly, question them. And that doesn't help when you have this whole realm of a lot of good that's being done, but also greenwashing that's being done, all kind of wrapped into the same term. So I don't know that it's necessarily the term itself that is a problem. I mean, we definitely need to be cognizant of greenwashing and claims that don't make sense or don't add value. But I don't know what a better term necessarily is. I mean, environmental sustainability is what people will sometimes say, or when we talk about from kind of an investor perspective, we talk about environmental, social, and governance. And they're challenging issues, and there's such, pervasive topics. They're such broad topics that I think one term doesn't capture all that we're trying to address. So I guess I would almost turn it around and say, do the students have a recommendation or a preference for how it should be talked about?
Okay, I'm well versed in that particular technique of turning things around. So I'll let you know how that goes.
Yeah. Okay.
Alison, I guess you get the last word. And then we have a couple of slides at the end, just letting people know what's coming up. So.
All right. Well, I actually love this question. I think it's super important because Mary Ellen said, words matter. And sustainability, climate change, decarbonization, those are not words that it doesn't resonate with the large majority of people. And when working on these issues, we need everybody working on them. So first and foremost, that's a concern to me about how we're talking about this and engaging people, because if they hear the word right away and they're like, nah, that doesn't have to do with me, it's going to be really hard to get them engaged in the conversation, whether a business or an individual. I think that I can understand the skepticism around sustainability, because when I tell people about the city, when we started back in 2005, it really was environmental conservation, right? We were working to reduce energy consumption. We were working to preserve water. We're working on tree canopy or recycling. And I think that's where what I have experienced, a lot of businesses get started. And then all of a sudden it became, sustainability was the hot word. And so everybody said, oh yeah, we're a sustainable company. But what they were really saying is, well, we practice environmental conservation where we can. And so I think that it's legitimate to question that, because, and then we came to the triple bottom line, or ESG, right? And it's supposed to be the 3 pillars. Well, most individuals, most businesses historically have always thought about the financial impacts, right? So now we've added, okay, now it's the environmental impacts. And then we're going to throw on this social governance part, or society, people, diversity, inclusion, equity, and all of that. Well, at that point in time, I've told people, what is not under the umbrella of sustainability? At that point in time, everything is. So how can you be, sustainable when it's inclusive of everything? So we identified sustainability as one of our values for the city. And if people look in our strategic plan, the way we defined it is along the lines of a triple bottom line definition. But really, for me, the word, it's a decision-making tool. As an individual or as an organization, I have to make a decision about whether I'm going to do this project or not. And if I really want to apply sustainability, I can't just think about, is it going to save me money or is it going to cost me money? I have to think about, what are the environmental ramifications of this project and what are the social ramifications of this project? So I'm not ever going to have a list of sustainability accomplishments, because to me, it is a methodology for how you make a decision. And I think that's become easy for people to say when really they're kind of like, yeah, we thought about it, but we're still making decisions based on the finances. Right. And so I think it becomes more difficult to really say, no, show me how you really thought about environmental implications or community people implications. And I think if somebody can actually walk you through that, right, then I feel like they've really applied sustainability. And so then we get to climate change, and then we get to environmental justice, right? And then we get to other terms that are now becoming more prominent. And we're actually working in the process of revising our definition of sustainability to explicitly call out climate change within it. And I've had these philosophical conversations, because you can do some things, that are specifically about climate change. You can do some things that are specifically about environmental conservation, and then you can do many things that address both. But some things don't, right? PFAS chemicals, I don't think climate change caused PFAS chemicals, right? And so that to me is not really a climate change issue. But it is an environmental issue, and something to be thoughtful about and to be working on, and particularly from the city's perspective, is important to us. So where we ultimately have landed is because we also, as I said, equity is a very important value for us. We've really landed predominantly on talking about environmental justice and talking about climate change, right? So I think many people here understand the climate change part, and that's our primary focus, although we are doing things in other spaces. But then we're also focused on environmental and climate justice, which to me is looking at when you have environmental pollutants and they are impacting your most vulnerable in your community, which in Grand Rapids has been statistically shown to be our Black and Brown community, that is environmental justice, right? The environmental pollutant is significantly impacting a specific race or ethnicity more than others. And so we've been really focused on that, things like increased lead poisoning in children due to flaking paint from homes, right? Again, is that a climate change issue? No, but it's a really important environmental justice issue. And so for those reasons, those types of projects have become of the highest priority for the city. So I have actually pulled away from classifying or talking things about our sustainability program. I've even thought about, should I change the name of the office from sustainability? Because I really think by and large, the bulk of our work is specific to climate change and environmental justice.
Nice. Some helpful distinctions there. Thanks. We've got about 45 seconds left. I'm going to end with a totally unfair question. So feel free not to answer, but you're both so close to this work. You both know the science. You have a sense of what's progress and what isn't. Are you feeling cautiously optimistic, relatively hopeful, despairing? How do you want to leave us?
Well, I'll go first, and maybe Mary will have a little bit more of a positive spin. And I shouldn't have laughed because it's not, and I want to keep it short. But for those that might not be aware, we had a very significant critical incident in our community where we had an officer-involved fatal shooting in our community of a Black man in our community. And that is, very difficult. And I bring that up because as much as I am passionate about climate change work and environmental justice work, I have learned on my equity journey that I can't do that work in a silo outside of all of the other equity issues that are happening in our community. And when you work for an organization like a city that is working on so many different topics, right? And when people come to me and they say, well, why isn't climate change the number one issue for the city? It is a top issue, and I'm grateful for that, but community police relations and affordable housing and keeping our economy going during a pandemic are always, those are higher priorities and things that we do. And so I am still optimistic in that I think by and large in my organization, I'm grateful that the leadership understands the importance of climate change and the intersectionality of it with other key priorities like affordable housing. But I am in a place where I've started to become a little frustrated, and I'm hoping as I have more conversations with people like you and others, we can start to come together to be thinking more, I think, about this adaptation role and what does that mean and how can we work collectively together to really be prepared and make sure those most vulnerable in our community are protected when we have these events.
Yeah, I know at Grand Valley, we look forward to those conversations. Mary Ellen, last word.
Yeah.
10 seconds.
Yeah. So I'm optimistic that many more people are talking about climate change and sustainability in general. So I really appreciate the awareness, and that is the most important thing to bring about change. Is that people are educating themselves, are definitely much more aware of different environmental issues, whether they're environmental justice issues, whether they're climate change specific, et cetera. So that they can do something different. And I do think, there are companies and other organizations that, can make these big commitments and can afford to make some big reductions, make some big changes. But it's going to take a lot more effort on everyone's part, especially to address the long term. And I think as a society, we're just not wired to think about the long term. So that is a challenge.
We're going to leave it there. Thank you both so much for taking time and
thank you.
And coming on to talk about this. And I look forward to further conversations.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Okay. Thank you.
And for those still on, we've got a couple of slides just letting you know what's coming up. And then we will see you again in fall. Thank you. Bye.